Uh, yes, that's art. Yeah, yeah, yeah. A form of lethal art. Yes, lethal art. We can elaborate on the concept of lethal arts later. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, this is the third and last session of our conference, and I am chairing. The first paper is by Sosi Kasbarian, and the title is Reconstructing Homeland, Imagined, Intentional, and Precarious. Sosi Kasbarian is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Stirling in Scotland, still in the great, in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom of everything. Dr. Kasbarian's research interests and publications broadly span diaspora studies, contemporary Middle East politics and society, nationalism, transnational political activism, refugee, displacement, and migration studies. She's the co-editor of the book, The Armenian Diaspora and Stateless Power, Collective Identity in the Transnational 20th Century, with Bloomsbury, 2023. And besides, as I said, she is co-editor of Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies. Sosi, your floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation and the organization of this conference. It's been an honor and a great pleasure to be amongst you the last couple of days. So this brief presentation today emanates from a larger project that I'm part of, funded by the British Academy, and it's called Should I Stay or Should I Go? Exploring Sense of Belonging and Intentions to Stay Among Young Newcomers to Armenia. And this is partners with the University of Stirling and Yerevan State University. So today I'm going to share some of my preliminary reflections on one aspect of this much wider project, and I'm happy to try and address any questions that come up about the wider project. But today I'm concentrating on the qualitative dimension of this research project, which was based on interviews with young, and we're defining young between sort of 20 and 39 individuals from Syria, Iran, Russia, Lebanon, Artsakh, and local Armenians, as well as focus groups comprised of these constituencies. In this presentation, I'm only focusing on the Syrians in Yerevan, so I'm drawing upon the qualitative findings of that particular aspect of the research project. The wider project situates itself in the body of work that recognizes that refugees, migrants, displaced, however they see themselves, are the best articulators of their own paths, however limited these parameters might be. So this is very much a people-centered approach which relies on interviews, conversations, biographical reflection in order to critically engage with and understand trajectories that are often contradictory, ambivalent, and shifting. So these interviews and focus groups also allow the subject to self-reflect and establish narrative authority over their own past, present, and future. So this is very much an ethnographically informed approach. It offers us a way in to give platform to the experiences and paths of those who are more often objects rather than subjects of their plights. So the wider project and the presentation I'm doing today will use an abundantly recorded, transcribed quotes from the respondents, and this is aimed to make them present and active, not only so that we hear their voices, but we listen to them. Alongside recorded interviews and more casual meetings, our fieldwork in Armenia was kind of ethnography of the deep hanging out type, and this I'm quoting Clifford and Geertz. This included frequenting Syrian spaces, restaurants, shops, market stalls, as well as striking up conversations when the opportunity presented itself. For example, Levantine restaurants are sites of diasporization, spaces where locals and diasporans partake in a more inclusive and expansive Armenian identity. For Syrians, they're also the sites where diaspora identities are being professed, performed, and validated. So in this kind of familiarity of the food, the music, the Western Armenian language, the pictures, the symbols, the smells and tastes of Syrian Armenian life in the company of other Syrian Armenians, Syrians are also performing and retrieving a lost home, remembering and reconstructing its comforts amid precarity. So in the new homeland in Armenia, diaspora identities are thus being kind of reinterpreted and transmitted. So I'm going to start with a series of quotes from our interviewees. The past was nice. We used to socialize and work with Armenians in Syria. The same here, just the opportunities are not so much. It is only Yerevan that is more or less active. I cannot predict anything for the future because the world is not stable and everything could happen tomorrow. The past was more certain. I knew what I was going to do in every phase of my life, but now everything is unpredictable. I want my future to be like my past in Syria, and I'm doing everything for it. The past and the present are similar. There was a war in the past, and there is a war in the present. I do not know what will be in the future, but I wish there was peace. I should say from the outset that the majority of these interviews were conducted in 2021, so right after the 2020 war, and obviously not capturing the recent events. So these three young voices reflect the Syrian Armenian experience of displacement, moving from their generations-long homes in war-torn Syria to an embattled Armenia. While Syria is considered devastated, the process of homemaking in Armenia is far from certain or secure. The 2020 war in Artsakh may have ended, but it is by no means over, casting long shadows and fueling a deep-seated sense of insecurity among people in Armenia. The continuing crises leaves Armenians fearful of existential catastrophe and in a state of anxiety. So anxiety really was a defining feature in all our interviews. So just a little bit of background here. Syrian refugees from the war, which wages since 2011, now number in excess of 6.5 million. These are figures from the UNHCR, and I checked them just a few weeks ago. Of these, an estimated 24,000 Syrians, mostly of ethnic Armenian origin, have arrived in the Republic of Armenia since 2011. So the local UNHCR office estimates that those who have stayed to number around 15,000. Again, it's quite hard to get, exact figures. Some have moved to other destinations which are perceived to hold more prospects temporarily or with a view to staying permanently. Some have returned to rebuild Syria. So in mapping these multi-directional movements, it's clear that Syrian Armenians' encounter with Armenia is a process of constant negotiation. So Armenia is alternatively a site of refuge, a historic or a potential homeland, or a temporary transit. Local, diasporan, and international actors, their remits and their agendas all play a role in this. But it is the individual, an active agent in negotiating their trajectory, that must continuously be recentered to counter narratives and regimes and structures that often flatten and reduce and silence them. More broadly, in my work, I've suggested the need for a broader conceptualization of the Middle East as a transnational terrain that includes the Republic of Armenia and is a vibrant site of diasporan life. By thinking transnationally rather than through the prism of methodological nationalism, we're able to engage with the everyday realities of people's movements and trajectories without assuming sedentariness, permanence, or homogeneity. So moving on to, very briefly, the concept of homeland, of course, is a key concept for diasporas and within diaspora studies. For diasporas, homeland is an orientation, it can be a unifying tool. In the Armenian case, of course, homeland is particularly complex, and we've talked a bit about that already today. Due to the absence of a direct link to the ancestral Ottoman homelands, the Republic of Armenia, with whom the Western diaspora, descendants of Ottoman Armenians, has no historical physical connection, serves as a substitute for a modern-day homeland. So diasporans have to negotiate the gap between an imagined lost homeland and an actual modern-day steppe homeland in the shape of the contemporary Armenian state. So this is my concept of the steppe homeland, which I suggest is a way of encapsulating a situation where two entities are not related by descent, but are forced into a familial relationship by external forces. That is, it's not a naturally occurring relationship, but one that is forged through circumstances, and of course can be nurtured and familiarized. The sense of steppeness also carries with it connotations of difficulty and a need for adjustment by both parties. So I know Razmik's going to talk about this later, but just briefly, as part of its nation-building project, Armenia encouraged diaspora migrations to Armenia during the Soviet period in organized drives, and since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been rebranding itself as a homeland for diasporans. It served as a site of refuge, temporary or permanent, for Armenians fleeing war and difficulties in their home states, from the Middle East in particular. The Syrian Armenians are the latest wave of diasporan Armenians seeking refuge from troubled homes. So just briefly here, Syrian Armenian culture is typical of Middle Eastern Armenianness and the Western established diaspora more widely. Most members of these communities trace their roots to the 1915 genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Turks. As such, the Syrian Armenians' encounter with Armenia is, to put it crudely, a meeting between Western and the Eastern Armenian experience. This is obviously quite reductive, and in the past 3 decades, we've seen how these two broad types of the Armenian experience have become much better acquainted. Nonetheless, there is a common feeling that there exists a mutual ignorance. Local Armenians, Hayastansis, ignorant of the Western diasporan experience, and the diaspora ignorant of the Soviet experience and the legacies that have shaped Armenian society. So one Syrian respondent who had moved to Armenia as a child with his family in the late 90s noted this change, and I'm going to quote what he says. When I was growing up here, the local Armenians spoke about diaspora, but they didn't really understand what it really meant, what it's like to be a diasporan Armenian. They had some ideas. They could ask you, where are your ancestors from? But they would never understand what it's like to live in another country and be a minority there. And this connection was resolved by modern day technology. Now you have Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever, all these social media platforms. It's much easier for them to connect and see what it's like, to hear stories on a more regular basis and a fresh basis, as opposed to generationally, grandpa telling his son, the son telling the grandchild, and stuff like that. Nonetheless, for many Syrian Armenians, being in Armenia is not a comfortable or an easy position, as they're caught between the home of attachment, Syria, and the new potential home of emplacement as a result of forced migration. While previous studies have acknowledged the challenges of settling in Armenia, economic, social, political, the 2020 war and its continuing reverberations, both at the local and the wider geopolitical level, adds another layer of critical precarity that I would suggest is qualitatively different. So this brief presentation and the project that it's part of argues that the 2020 Artsakh war and its continuing reverberations have rendered Armenia a precarious homeland for Syrian refugees. So this precarity potentially jeopardizes the intentionality of many Syrian Armenians to stay in Armenia. So just broadly reflecting here in terms of what this case kind of represents within diaspora studies, this is an extraordinary case where diasporans have been forcefully displaced from an actively constructed, rooted, and nurtured home in diaspora and compelled to take refuge in a relatively unfamiliar homeland, one which is neither stable or secure. So the case of Syrian Armenians is disruptive to prevailing linear notions of home, homeland, nation, and diaspora. So it invites us to engage more substantially with the nuances and complexities of multi-layered identities reconfigured through war and continuing precarity. So, as I mentioned briefly, before the 2020 war, the Syrians were the latest significant wave of displaced ethnic Armenians taking refuge in Armenia due to war in their home countries. So prior arrivals included Iraqi, Iranian, Palestinian, Lebanese Armenians, Armenians from Azerbaijan in the late 80s and the early 90s. I think it is important to differentiate between different arrivals, as the idea that they're all Armenian of some description and therefore can smoothly slot into the Republic of Armenia is far from the case. It also risks homogenizing very diverse constituencies, most of whom are very aware of the intra-diaspora differences in their everyday interactions and their sense of self. This labeling and identification within the Armenian diaspora persists, reflecting people's layered identities and multiple attachments, but also because each of these diaspora identities carries with it cultural connotations and historical reverberations. So, for example, Syria High, Halepsi, Kesapsi, Lipana High, these particular carry with them particular connotations and reverberations. They're a shorthand way of introducing oneself as it presents one's ancestral path and collective story, and also acts as a way of connection and mutual recognition within the wider Armenian collectivity. So decades earlier, Syrians were a substantial component of the Nerkach, the gathering in repatriation program of Soviet Armenia from the 20s to the 60s, mostly in the period 1946 to 47, as the Soviet authorities and some diaspora organizations tried to promote Armenia as a homeland for all Armenians and also potentially to destabilize the diaspora. This move from diaspora to steppe homeland was disappointing for some, such that many of them returned to the diaspora when they could. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Armenia has sought to actively build relations with the diaspora and rebrand itself as a homeland for diasporans. So from the late 1990s, we've also seen this small-scale trend of diasporan Armenians forging connections with Armenia for business, study, philanthropy, as visitors and residents of varying periods. So this also included a number of Syrians trying out living in Armenia. So this was when I first did fieldwork in Armenia in 2001. There were a number of Syrians and Lebanese sort of living in between Syria and Armenia, between two homes, exploring their options and planning to stay longer term depending on opportunities. So when the civil war broke out, some Syrian Armenians had already established connections with Armenia, were able to mobilize and build on these. So all this to say that the contemporary Syrian experience in Armenia is a varied one. It encompasses a range of experiences differentiated by factors including wealth and means, date and manner of arrival, class and connections, educational and professional background. All this constructs a multi-layered experience, interpreted variously as exile, displacement, migration, or homecoming by the Syrians themselves and the state and non-state actors and the local population. So the uncertainty of this positionality has been exacerbated by the 2020 war and the continuing precarity and crises that define Armenia now. So research on societies in the context of a recent war and continuing precarity is by nature limited and inconclusive. So this is a brief snapshot which introduces several themes that emerge in the findings of our fieldwork and seeks to capture the complexities of an unstable situation. While many Syrians seem settled, the Artsakh war has raised questions about their plans to stay in Armenia. So respondents looked back on the decision to make a life in Armenia, questioning its viability in a climate of insecurity. When reflecting on the temporal, the recent war featured highly in responses. So we have some quotes here. The past was nice, the present is not bad, but the future is blurred. Yes, the past was fine. I'm not sure about the present, but I hope the future will be nice. The past was amazing. We were adapted to our city, to our neighbors in our life. We are trying to create the same here, but there's a lot of work we need to do. About the future, I have no idea about the future. I wish it was like my past, but if there is another war, I do not know. We also spent time interviewing particularly students from the various universities, and here again, there is confirmation that the war had been a traumatic but also changing experience where, you know, their physical trajectories are likely to be altered. So I have one quote from a student at the American University. I know so many people who actually want to leave Armenia afterwards, after university, and it's mostly concern from the recent war that happened in Artsakh, and they're afraid it's going to happen again or something big is going to happen. So they're just preparing. So like, okay, after university, I'm going to leave. There are many people like that right now. So the war has taken a huge toll, I'm quoting here, on so many of the students. After that, it just didn't feel the same. So we have the optimism of the Velvet Revolution, which many of them reflected on, being replaced by a sense of hopelessness. So young people who have options, maybe have more than Armenian citizenship or are financially secure or in some way privileged, are weighing up these possibilities of moving somewhere safer, which offers them a more stable life and better long-term prospects, regardless of any professed commitment or attachment to Armenia. So this is quite an interesting, ambivalent situation, because there is this professed intention to stay, desire to stay, but then this, realization that there is a shifting terrain here, and they need to sort of reconsider their intentions. The influx of displaced refugees from Artsakh, arrivals from Russia and Ukraine have also had an impact on what is a small economy. So this, coupled with continuing crises, is having a detrimental effect on both physical and mental survival, as well as a sense of agency over the future. So the faith in Armenia as homeland was central in intention to stay, even while recognizing its precarity. So we had respondents who were very conscious that moving is part of the Armenian experience, but that staying in Armenia offered some security, even in precarity. So I'm quoting from some interviews here. I'm sure we will live here. This is our homeland. We have moved to our homeland. Our children are growing up here, and I do not want to move from one place to another with my children every time. I want to stay here for my children. I want them to remember their mother tongue. When there was the war in Syria, everybody thought that it's time to move to our homeland. If we have a job and can earn a living, we will not move anywhere else. We love our homeland very much. We're dreaming about moving to our fatherland for years. We're living here for about 6 years, and I'm still getting excited when I see Ararat Mountain. This is like a dream. So, despite almost always professing intentionality to stay in their new homes in Yerevan and seeming quite settled, the loss of Syria as homeland is also a huge wound for many. For some respondents, Syria is the homeland they long for, and Armenia has become a difficult adjustment. Being Syrian is also a point of pride, regardless of how they are perceived in Armenia. Some quoting from a few interviews here. I am proud that I am Syrian, and I will tell to everyone that my background is from Syria. I was born in Syria, raised in Syria. I came in my life to this stage because I was Syrian. I made my decisions in a certain way because I was Syrian. But the Syria that I know is something different to the Syria today. And another quote. Local people tell me that Armenians from Syria are hardworking people. They tell me that they like our dialect and we should not change it as it sounds very nice. I did not face any discrimination. So most of our respondents said that they had, local friends and local circles, but their closest friends remained Syrian Armenians or other diasporan Armenians. And this was sort of accompanied by a general preference for working with non-local Armenians, as they said it was easier. This corresponds to the idea that diaspora Armenians are not always able to comprehend the style, codes, and hidden transcripts that local Armenians and arguably Russians and other post-Soviet groups share. This distinction between what some call mentalities or sensibilities due to distinct historical paths and experiences can leave one feeling unmoored despite being among fellow Armenians. For those who live in diaspora, it is the diasporan infrastructure, socialization, and culture that becomes home. So Nare Gastian, in the book that you mentioned that has just come out, that I edited, she's written on how some Syrian Armenians feel more comfortable moving to another diaspora community, in the case of her paper, the Netherlands, rather than they do staying in Armenia. Swapping one diaspora community for another is less of a mental and behavioral upheaval than adjusting to life in Armenia. For some Syrian Armenians, the diaspora is the familiar home and an easier place to be if given the choice. So despite the destruction of Syria, though, many Syrian Armenians have also returned to Syria to rebuild their homes and communities, or in the case of one of our respondents, intending to do so. These variations in trajectories suggest that people make decisions to move or stay, not as reactions or just for practical reasons, but out of a sense of long-term intentionality, cognizant of choosing a course not just for themselves, but for their descendants. Often the intentionality to stay is explained through the theme of collective duty and patriotism, setting aside one's own situation. So there were many quotes also like this, which kind of really highlighted the sense of intention and collective commitment. I'm going to read these. I have a sense of duty. Many people are leaving, but we need people to stay and live here. I and my friends are here. We are responsible for our history. Many people died trying to save this small country, and we need people who will live here. Otherwise, why did these people die? Regardless of the economic situation, people should stay in Armenia or at least visit it very often as we did. Due to the genocide, many people were forced to live and grow up in other countries, but we have to know that our homeland is here. And another quote. I have both responsibility and willingness to do whatever I can for my country. I have many disappointments, but also there are many positive things. We should change whatever is negative and develop everything positive. So unsurprisingly, the theme that emerged most strongly in our fieldwork about intentions to stay was the impact of the war in rendering Armenia a precarious homeland. So many respondents identified themselves and their future as intertwined with that of the country. and therefore saw their lives as precarious as well. I'm just wrapping up here, and I'll quote these. I have my life here. My future will be like the future of the country. We will see. But I worry about the security of my family and friends, as the risk of war exists always here. Also, the unstable political processes are my concern. The war in Karabakh, which influences life in Yerevan very much, almost every day we read that in this or that place there were shootings and people died. The war is going on right now, and tomorrow another large-scale war can start. I share all the same concerns about the future as all the Armenians. We feel unsafe in Armenia. So, just to conclude, this small kind of preliminary snapshot seeks to be, as part of a wider project which is contributing to the study of Syrian refugees and migrants, focusing on one destination city, Yerevan. And while previous studies have looked at the challenges of Armenian refugees and migrants settling in Armenia, the 2020 war and its continuing reverberations at the local and the broader geopolitical level add a layer of critical precarity to this particular case. So this project so far suggests that the war and its continuing aftershocks have depicted and rendered Armenia as a precarious homeland. This precarity jeopardizes the defining feature that we found amongst the Syrians, which was their intentionality to stay in Armenia. So research in the aftermath of war and continuing precarity is inevitably conclusive. But I think that this case of the Syrian-Armenian migration to Armenia is also disruptive to prevailing ideas about home, homeland, and diaspora, and invites us to engage more substantially with people's lives and choices and agencies reconfigured through war and precarity. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to the last paper of this session and conference by Razmik Panosyan. In many ways, we stay in the in the area of Armenian Syrian studies, because Razmik Panosyan was actually born out there years ago. He is director of the Armenian Communities Department at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon, and he is the author, among others, of the critically acclaimed book, The Armenians, From Kings and Priests to Merchants and Commissars. And various other academic publications. Of course, he, prior to his coming to the Gulbenkian Foundation, going to the Gulbenkian Foundation 10 years ago, he worked for a Canadian governmental agency in Montreal, devoted to international human rights promotion and democratic development, a consultant for UNDP in New York. He got his PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2000. He also subsequently taught there. But luckily for the Armenians worldwide, he decided to move to the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. Please have the floor. We improvised the lectern here for Razmik, and we'll make the best of it.
I have the most low-tech presentation, no PowerPoint, paper. I'm going to speak from paper, so I made a little lectern. And because people said that hearing is a bit difficult, it's better to stand up. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm speaking, I got invited, and I'm speaking as an expert on these subjects, not as a representative of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, although one could never put their professional life aside. It's also rather symbolic that I'm giving a lecture in a hall that has, in a museum that has bicycle-themed displays, because the first time I actually came to Romania, about 12 years ago, I came on a bicycle. So I was on a biking trip and I cycled into Romania, not Budapest, in the West. So Let me start, by saying that last night I had a short conversation with Avedis Hajian about the war and the impact of this latest war, of the 2023 war, and the emptying of Karabakh, and the impact that has had on the thinking of many of us. And I realized that it had the completely opposite impact on our thinking. Whereas Professor Hajian was saying that he's much more focused on Armenia and how we should be focused in Armenia, I came to the polar opposite conclusion, that we should be focusing more on the diaspora. And so what I want to do is explain a little bit this. And my whole project, the research project that I have done in the past and sort of the work that I do now, is centered on putting the diaspora back at center stage, both historically and currently. And this actually makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and I must say that, because we are absolutely ingrained in us that it's Armenia, Armenia, Armenia. But actually, that's a social construct, and I'm going to address a little bit that. So, having given that a bit of introduction, let me also say that the prism through which I'm coming to this, the perspective through which I'm coming to this topic, is the approach of study of nationalism and nation building. I don't use nationalism in a negative sense here, because I know that in the Soviet context, it always meant something negative. The paradigmatic approach here, the most common approach, is that states like France, Germany, Italy, those are the examples often given, states build nations in the modern period. We're talking about the modern period. The less successful example is Spain, that it couldn't build a coherent nation. And in this process of states building nations, many conflicts emerge, and the Balkans next door is a good example of this. The common point throughout all this is that there is a center, state-affiliated center, a capital city, that builds a people. In other words, it defines the we in the American Constitution, we, the people, it defines who the we is. My talk is about the exception. My talk is the exception where a diaspora, a dispersed people, build a nation, and they build a nation very successfully. And that exception, of course, is the Armenians. Well, the Armenians I'm going to talk about. There are other historic examples. However, in this case, the nation that was created, while it had some commonalities, Armenians are, after all, one nation, it also had very deep divisions. Cultural divisions, linguistic divisions, political divisions. Yes, it was one nation, but not a homogeneous one. And we saw that earlier in the panel, that even within the same community, the diasporan community, how diverse Armenians could be. The way I termed this in my book is a multi-local nation building process. So multi-local is a theme that I will come to later on, and other academics use other terms, like Sebu Aslanyan uses polycentric nation. So I will spend a few minutes, about 2/5 of my presentation, about this multi-local argument, and the rest about diaspora nation building. So the multi-local argument. The intellectual centers that imagined modern Armenian nation, 18th century onwards, stretch from Madras in India to Tiflis or Tbilisi in the Russian Empire, Istanbul or Bolis in the Ottoman Empire, to Venice, Vienna, Dorpat. None of these are in historic Armenia. In the 20th century, what I will talk about, it continued in Lebanon, Syria, Paris, and other diasporan communities, but in addition to Yerevan, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. We know, for example, the first Armenian newspaper was published in Madras in the 1790s. The first Armenian book was published in Venice in 1512. Only 260 years later, in 1771, the first Armenian book was published in Armenia, in Varashabat, in that case. We know of the Mkhitarist order, the Catholic Mkhitarist order, which was absolutely central to the Armenian Renaissance, to the Zartung. and that was headquartered in Venice and in Vienna. It had crucial presence. Its clerics had crucial presence in Volis and historic Armenia. We know that the political parties that are still with us, the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks, were established in Tbilisi and in Geneva, with the Armenagans being founded in Van, in historic Armenia. So, in short, it was mostly Armenians in diaspora who were imagining, in a Benedict Andersonian sense of imagining, they were imagining the nation and undertaking the intellectual work that was necessary to build one. The books, the magazines, the poetry, the political tracts, the mobilization, etc., etc. And we're only talking about a few thousand intellectuals. We're not talking about millions of people. I mean, our entire Zartunk was done by 3,000-4,000 young men and some women, by intellectuals. But they, as I said, it was a few thousand. So broadly speaking, initially 2 and subsequently 3 intellectual movements emerged in the Armenian world of the 18th and the 19th centuries, reflecting the imperial divisions of that time, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. The first of this movement was the Eastern Point, what I call the Eastern Point in the Russian Empire, centered in Tbilisi, Dorpat, now in Estonia, I think, Dorpat, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. Yerevan, we have to remember, was a small village at this point. The second intellectual movement, what I call the Western Point, was centered in Constantinople, in Venice, Vienna, Paris, and a few other Western European cities. In the second half of the 19th century, a third point emerged, and that was around Van, in historic Armenia, and that too started thinking about these national issues and the Renaissance, the Zartok. So, when we examine these 3 movements, we can see, especially between the Eastern and Western points, we see that there were pronounced differences between these currents. The first and the most obvious difference was language. Armenians like 2 of everything, right? And 2 Catholici, 2 of these 2. That we have 2 vernacular languages, not 1. We have the Eastern Armenian and the Western Armenian. 2 literary standards emerged, reflecting one, the dialect spoken in and around Yerevan, that became and Tbilisi, that became the Eastern Armenian variant, and then the Constantinople dialect became the Western Armenian variant. So we have 2 vernacular languages. In terms of literature that was being written in Armenian, we have, again, two traditions. In the Eastern Point, it was national liberation, collective action. Literature was about this. We know about Rafi, Khachadur Apovian, and so forth. Whereas in the Western Point, the literature was more realism. Class relations, alienation, social issues. Arpiyarian and his Arabic journal are the best example of this, but we remember Rafi and Khachadur Apovian much more than that. Of course, I'm simplifying a very complex process, but that goes without saying. And then in the second half of the 19th century, as I said, provincial literature emerged in and around Van. Khrimian Hayrik, before he became Khrimian Hayrik, was the champion of this, which situated the suffering of the local population of the peasants at the heart of the literature. And very importantly, in terms of political ideology, differences emerged. The Eastern Point was more influenced by German Romanticism, radicalism, and revolutionary nationalism. We saw some of that in the work of Professor Shukasian in terms of the artistic expression of this romantic artistic expression. The Western Point was more influenced by French and Italian thought, constitutionalism, a reformist approach to politics. And again, the Central Point situated the conditions of the peasantry at the heart of it. Now, the details are not terribly important. The point that I'm making is twofold. First is the multi-local nature of the Armenian nation-building process. None of them managed through a state or anything resembling a state structure, much less a centralizing state. Rather, communal organizations, diaspora organizations, loose network of intellectuals, and then political parties advocating reform or revolution were the agents of this nation-building process. And the second point, again, is the diversity, the lack of homogeneity that was built right into modern Armenian identity from the start. So for example, when like Hagop's research and others talked about when people say, well, Haya stances are like this or Spilka Hayas are like this, there are profound differences in these two different peoples, and those differences have very deep roots that go back to our Zartov, back to our Renaissance. And of course, I should also say that when I'm talking about modern Armenian national identity building, I'm not at all saying that Armenians are not an ancient people. Ethno-religious Armenian identity is thousands of years old. Something happened in the 18th and 19th century that ethno-religious identity got transformed into a modern political national identity or politicized national identity. Again, we're talking about one nation. We're not talking about two nations, but we're talking about profound differences. And all of these differences is glossed over with this subjective sense of belonging, you know, a sense of the sense of history that we have. So in this context, the genocide takes place in 1915, and the hub of the Western Point, the people to be liberated, conscientized, educated, they were decimated, and the survivors diasporicized. With this, the reformist political ideology died, and the romantic revolutionary nationalism became the hegemonic political discourse. So 1915, the Western Point is decimated, you know, Bolis Armenians survive, of course, and in 1920, the Eastern Point is Sovietized. So in these 2 points, nation building continued in the 20th century, in Soviet Armenia and in the diaspora, but in very peculiar different ways. Peculiar in the Soviet Union because it was Soviet style. It was Soviet style nation building. Especially after Stalin's death, it combined nationalism with communism, and in the diaspora, it was diaspora nation building, especially in Syria, Lebanon, France, and the United States, with very important differences between them. I don't know enough about Eastern Europe to talk about Eastern Europe. So when I'm talking about the diaspora, I'm not talking about Eastern Europe, where Romania is a very unique situation. So let me turn into to the bulk of the core of my presentation, the 20th century nation building in the diaspora. Now imagine yourself a community leader in the 1920s in Lebanon or Syria, where the bulk of the genocide survivors have arrived, several hundreds thousand people. You have in your hands a disparate, a diverse group of people with no common language. They spoke dialects or Turkish, mostly local identities and not necessarily a pan-national identity, different social strata, different political loyalties, bewildered, uprooted from their ancestral lands. The only commonality that they have, about 95% of them, if not more, they belong to the Armenian Apostolic Church. So what to do? What is to be done? Despite the political differences, the political parties, the ARF, the Dashnaks, the Hınçaks, and the Ramgavras, they sort of became governments of exile. Not governments in exile, but governments of exile. This is Hachik Tololian's term. And they gave themselves the task of building a nation in diaspora, not only to keep, but to strengthen collective identity, to create a homogeneous, as much as they could, diaspora nation that would continue to dream about the homeland and one day to return to that homeland. This process was cut off, and in some cases in opposition to the Soviet Armenia, and what was going on in Soviet Armenia, at least until the 1960s. Now, of course, it also helped that they were physically together, condensed in in a few geographic areas, in a ghetto or in a refugee camps, and that the host societies themselves had put some social barriers or sometimes legal barriers insofar as they saw the Armenians as a distinct community outside of their own communities. And again, this was reflected in the political setup in these countries. But the essential drive for the Armenians to remain a distinct group came from within. So diaspora nation building was, how did they do this? There were three factors, three processes through which they built this diaspora nation. The first was education, the second was language, and the third was nationalist ideology. So in terms of education, they set up to establish secular community schools, which were controlled by the political parties or affiliated organizations, or sometimes controlled by the church. This was something that could be done in the Middle East, but not necessarily in Europe and in Americas, where Armenian schools came much later in the 1960s. So scores of Armenian community national schools in the Middle East were established. In the 1970s, I believe there were 40 or so Armenian schools, if not more, only in Lebanon. Now there are 16. In terms of language, Western Armenian, with the exception of Iran, Western Armenian became the signifier of a new national identity parallel to but distinct from the church. So it was back then a novel idea that an Armenian person had to speak the Armenian language. This was something that was really ingrained during the Zartung and then really ingrained in the diaspora in the 1920s. It was not necessarily the norm. So local dialects were condemned as parochial, that should be forgotten, and the use of Turkish, of course, was vehemently denounced. It is therefore quite remarkable that within one generation, an Armenophone, an Armenian-speaking, an Armenophone community was established. Parents learned the language from their children who went to Armenian school. So schools, newspaper, cultural events, pop music, all of these emerged in Western Armenian, and the language became a lingua franca. Again, mostly in the Middle East. Not so much in Europe and USA, where, as I said, day schools were established much later. And acculturation into mainstream society was a lot easier. In North America, the Apostolic Church played more of an important role in keeping the community distinct. And of course, the church played an important role everywhere. But so whereas language was really dominant in terms of identity in the Middle East, the church assumed this role in North America and Europe. So finally, in addition to language and education, there was also nationalist ideology. And this was perhaps the most important component of diaspora and Armenian identity. Despite the ideological differences about how to relate to Soviet Armenia, the two main parties disagreed on that, there was a general consensus of what constituted an ideal Armenian. First, as I mentioned, language was the key. Even if one did not know it, language was the key. Second was knowledge and pride in history, being the first Christian nation, being that sense of pride in our history. The third was a commitment to the Armenian cause, which included liberation of the lost lands in Turkey, and in the case of the Dashnaks, liberation from Soviet yoke, at least until the 1970s. So the third was this political project called the Armenian cause. The fourth was there was a notion of return, that one day we're going to return to the homeland, i.e. to Western Armenia, or the liberation of historic lands. The fifth was activism and participation in community organizations. A good Armenian had to be involved in community organizations, both men and women. Of course, the public domain dominated by men, and the domain of women was meant to be behind the scenes community work. Sixth was membership to the Apostolic Church, or at the very least to the Catholic or Protestant Armenian Christian congregations. At this point, non-Christian Armenians was not something that was on the agenda. That came onto the agenda only in the 2000s in Turkey. Seventh was a loose belief in socialism in the case of the Hınçaks and the Dashnaks, and liberalism in the case of the Ramgavars, but this was sort of loose thing in the background. And finally, the eighth point is that there was constantly a very strong element of anti-Turkishness in this ideology. So these ideas were propagated throughout the community in formal and informal ways until they were internalized and they became part of the subconscious. They became banal, as in the parlance of Michael Billig. So this was, as I said, the model of a good Armenian. It was the norm in the Middle East and aspired to in Europe and North America up until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, something happens in the Middle East. Well, earlier, the civil wars, the political upheaval, and there is intra-diaspora migration of many Middle Easterns going to the West, to Europe and to North America, and sort of becoming the intellectuals of those communities. Now, 1980s comes along, and there's a new diasporan identity emerging, particularly in the West, because we know national identity, like all identities, social identities, is susceptible to many influences, and it changes. It's not static at all. In the Middle East, it remained somewhat static, but in the West, it did not. It evolved into new directions. Some theorists would say into postmodern directions, but it evolved. And in this new sense of belonging, diasporan identity, was quite different. It was reformulated in ways that traditional Armenian identity, it didn't fit into traditional Armenian identity. The quote-unquote objective factors of language and traditional cultural markers established by community organizations and politics, the church, and the notion of return no longer were central. These were sort of put aside, but feeling Armenian was. You know, Ani Bakalyan was already mentioned, her memorable line, from being Armenian to feeling Armenian, or thinking Armenian. So it was symbolic ethnicity. And until 1988, 1991 period, the homeland had become a culturally foreign, emotionally remote concept for most diasporans in the West. Society where they lived had become home as the boundaries around the community eroded. And the Armenian Diaspora Survey that some of you might know, it was done here in Romania as well in 2018 or 19, it shows this. I mean, let me just give you one statistic here. To the question of which of the following you consider your homeland. This is a massive diaspora-wide survey. In Romania, okay, let me give you the other countries. Where do you consider your homeland? The country where I was born. Argentina said 75%. My homeland is Argentina. Canada, 40%. Lebanon, 52%. And the highest is Romania, where 77% of Romanians said that where they were born, i.e. Romania, is their homeland. 22% said the Republic of Armenia. The percentages don't add up because you could choose more than one. You could choose, I think, 3 options. So the notion of the homeland was completely shifting. Now, this doesn't mean that the diaspora was withering away, disappearing. Some elements are, we all know that. Rather, it was developing, it is developing into a unique and entity based on hybrid and hyphenated identities and dual loyalties. So we are Armenian and American, Armenian and British, Armenian and Romanian, Armenian and Argentinian, so forth and so on. Now, what makes this new diaspora connected to Armenianness is its active commitment to the Armenian nation as a distinct group, however characterized. It's a political involvement in pursuit of a national cause, however defined. It's mobilization on behalf of other Armenian communities. So if there's a crisis in Lebanon, you raise money in Los Angeles, you mobilize on that. And of course, you mobilize on genocide recognition and the political projects like that, but without the real desire of returning to the homeland. It's all very subjective. It's a subjective sense of belonging. And here, I would say that I actually reject any notion of trying to come up with an objective definition of who Armenians are. The best definition of who an Armenian is that I have heard is by Vahe Oshagan at the first Armenia Diaspora Conference. He said, Armenian is an Armenian when he or she says that I am Armenian and strives to be a better one. I changed that a little bit. I said that an Armenian is an Armenian when he or she says, I'm Armenian and does something about it. So there is a little bit of activism involved and obviously have to be recognized as such by others. So, it's a collective notion, the collective memory and, Havagagan Hishogutun, it's part of this, but it's nothing really objective. So in this scene, the Karabakh movement comes, 1988 comes, and then 1991 independence. And something interesting happens here. In 1988 and 89, when the movement began, there is the slogan of Tebi Yergir, towards the homeland, that the Dashnak party started and it caught on. So it symbolized that, okay, now there is something, Armenia is independent, Tebi Yergir, to the homeland. By the way, slogan recycled from the early 20th century. So this meant that diaspora more or less stopped imagining about itself and focused almost exclusively on Armenia. Diaspora had a rich tradition of thinking for itself and in itself, about its own issues, about its own identity. And this long tradition of diasporan political and cultural thinking, all of this was taken and parked in Yerevan. Metaphorically speaking, we forgot that we had Shahan Shahnu, Zarev Orkuni, Harutyun Kurkjian, the Haraj newspaper, the Midgaveh series of essays, etc., and we sort of made this secondary. And this made very good sense in 1991. Armenia was at war, Armenia had suffered an earthquake, and we had to focus on the homeland. But let's be honest, it also weakened the diaspora. It weakened diasporan institutions. Then years passed, and somehow Armenia did not turn out to be the country of our dreams. Yes, it won the Karabakh War, but it had become a corrupt, oligarchic, semi-free country. And some diasporans started expressing some disillusion, thinking about this, but not really talking about it publicly. 2020 comes, the war, Armenia is defeated, and then last month, Karabakh is lost. But 2020 started being a turning point for diasporans to restart thinking about itself, to pick up the pieces, so to speak, from 1991. And symbolically, I think it's important, Aram Katolikos's declaration that 2022 was the year of the diaspora, and then he repeated it in 2023. So it was a symbolic way of saying that, okay, we're going to start thinking about the diaspora a bit more. This doesn't mean that we're turning our back on the homeland or turning our back to Armenia. I don't want to be misunderstood or misquoted that Razmik Panosyan is saying forget Armenia. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the pendulum needs to swing a little bit, and it needs to swing towards diaspora. Once again, the diaspora should take its rightful place in nation building and the national imagination. So, in conclusion, where are we at now? The descendants of these two nation-building movements, the diasporans whose roots go to the Ottoman Empire and the descendants of the Russian Armenians, are continuing to build their identities. This time, they are much more connected. There is no Iron Curtain. Now, there is the added, however, complication that there is a new diaspora that has to be taken into account, the new diaspora from post-independent Armenia. How they will evolve, well, we have researchers like Agora doing some work on that, but we don't know yet fully how it will evolve. We have an Armenia that is under tremendous stress. We hope for its survival. We work for its survival and prosperity, but it is under stress. But we must also work for the survival and prosperity, the vitality, not just the preservation, the vitality and the prosperity of the diaspora. We have issues to solve here, as the Armenian Diaspora Survey shows. We have leadership crisis, use of the language, education, keeping the youth interested. These are all issues that the diaspora has to grapple with. Let me give you another example from this. There was a question. What are the biggest challenges to the strength of your Armenian community? So what are the biggest challenges to the Armenian community? Lack of visionary leadership in Armenian community. 48% of the respondents in Lebanon said that we have a big challenge of the lack of visionary leadership in Armenian community. The lowest was in Romania. So, kudos to the Romanian leadership, but only 19% said that there is a lack of strong leadership. So, but Lebanon was the highest, Canada was 39%, Argentina was 29%. Then the lack of opportunity to speak Armenian language. 28% in Romania said that this is a challenge for the Armenian community here in Romania, the highest, which is interesting. So, we have data that says what are the issues that we should be concerned about and work on. And there are huge challenges for diasporan communities to start addressing these issues. In 2014, I wrote a short essay called The Drunkenness of Statehood. This is before the wars. And in this short essay, I argued that 50 or 100 or 200 years down the road, there will be an Armenian diaspora. We will not recognize it. It'll be different from us. They might not be speaking Armenian. But there will be Armenians around the world who will call themselves diaspora Armenians and who will mobilize on certain issues, national issues. Now, I certainly hope there will be an independent, strong, vibrant, prosperous, and democratic Armenia. This is our goal. But the geopolitical, demographic, and most worrisome, the military trends, again, this is in 2014, military trends paint another depressing picture. Of course, Armenians will remain on the current territory of Armenia, but will it be an independent state? Will it be a self-governing region in an empire? Will it be a besieged enclave surrounded by enemies? Hopefully, it will be part of the European Union, a beacon of democracy. We don't know. But if Armenians once again find themselves stateless or find themselves in a crisis situation, which state cannot be of help, that has been the case for 1,000 years. Who is to support it if not an organized diaspora led by strong institutions with its own sense of purpose, with a vibrant culture and an identity as diaspora Armenians? So let us continue with our traditional multi-local nation and identity building in diaspora and in Armenia in all its diversity. So yes, states are important, but we should not be sacrificing the Armenian diaspora, an entity that has sustained culture, learning, and identity for centuries at the altar of a 32-year-old state. Thank you very much. Should I stay here?
Thank you very much, Razmik, for this wonderful horizon against which we can actually think and rethink some of our presentations over these last 2 days. Before we get to the associate, you may please come up here, and also you, Razmik, we can be seated for here for a while for the discussion part. Just want to make a point. State and the diaspora. There is an interesting historical point to remember when thinking about state and diaspora, namely the existence of pre-state, quasi-state, post-state networks, entities, movements in empires or in multinational federation or confederations that are organized politically in various ways. And I'll give you just one example. The example of Romanians from the other side of the Carpathians, who from the moment of the national reinvention, which is the 18th century worldwide. This is not only the case with the Armenians, this is simply the moment when the second header imagines nations the way we still imagine them today. Having a spirit, a Volksgeist, having a voice, a Volksstimme, and things of the sort. And of course, a soul, a Volksseele, and all these wonderful things that was picking up as a diligent student from the very, very, how shall I say, complex, yes, would be the best term, course of Immanuel Kant on geography, which was about absolutely everything else than geography, which was heavily attended. He taught that course for about 50 years, by the way, in Königsberg at his hometown and university, right? And he was changing it all the time. We all know some transcripts of his later years. We don't know exactly what he was telling his students before, but we somehow know from the side effects of his course, which was, of course, the best attended, because it seemed to be intelligible, which unfortunately most of the other classes taught by Immanuel Kant seemed not to be. There are avid students from all over the place, not only from all the German states, that would be normal, but also from all over the place in Central and Eastern Europe and from Russia. Russian early national ideologies are, imprinted very heavily by this. But this is a beautiful episode in the history of ideas that I'm not now. What was going on before, beyond the Carpathians, on the western side of the Carpathian Basin, under Hungarian and then Austrian, Habsburg, Austrian, Hungarian domination? Romanians are starting, besides developing an early, pre-romantic, second Herderian vision of their own national identity, they were starting to build associations and community-based groups. They were around the church, they were around other things, and slowly, by the end of the 19th century, Transylvania, Maramuresh, the Banat were thriving networks of Romanian-controlled and Romanian only schools, banks, economic associations. It was a kind of quasi-state or pre-state operating under the radar being known by the authorities, who were not smart enough to dismantle them in time. And then, what do you know? In 1918, when the union with the other Romanian principalities happened, with the Kingdom of Romania happened, it was the old kingdom that imported specialists and experts from Transylvania, and from banks, from schools, and so forth, for the new cadre of the greater Romania. So things are happening also, my point is, distinctly from the existence of the state, or sometimes even without the project of a state. Because that is important to remember for Romanians and others, that even nationalisms do not always imagine in an Andersonian and any other way a state. Some of the most ardent nationalisms of Western Europe, of well, obviously Central and Eastern Europe, were developing without the plan of a state. I'll just give you one extraordinary example. Romanian historian Nicolae Iorga, who single-handedly has written libraries of books and newspapers. He was writing a newspaper every day, so you can imagine that he was writing a daily, besides writing thousands of books. So Iorga was talking to an association of educated aristocratic ladies in 1899, and talking about the future of the Romanian state, of the Romanian nation, and of its state. And in 1899, this most ardent nationalist never mentioned the possibility of greater Romania, of the unification or annexation of Transylvania and things of the sort, other than by, referring to a rather distant future. So, and this happened, of course, 20 years later, but even him was not fantasizing. Some were, but some of the figures of authority. This doesn't mean that the Romanian identity was any less ardent and any less enthusiastically built in Transylvania and everything. Simply, the existence of a state was deemed not exactly plausible or immediately possible, and things of the sort. So that was just to put these ideas out. You don't really need to have it. You can imagine a diaspora just close by, on the other side of a frontier in an empire, which was the case with the diaspora, as it were, the local diaspora, the native diaspora that was always fixed territorially, which was the diaspora living in another state, and being transformed into diaspora precisely because they were living in a different political arrangement. So things are complicated and fascinating. As a counterpoint to all these very serious discussions, I want to bring in, for a few minutes before we have a general discussion, a few lines that were sent to me yesterday by Petros Horasanjan, the Romanian writer, Armenian Romanian writer, who was supposed to come here, join us, but due to his health issues these days, couldn't make it. I'm translating rather roughly from his Romanian, which is a very, how shall I put it? Very florid, very interesting, very tricky kind of Romania, replete with all the forms of language that were forgotten by most living Romanians, and then, of course, all kinds of
it's poetic.
Tropes. It is poetic as it gets. Now, many years ago, Horasanjan, with my dubbing, many years ago, anyway, before 1989, I got to an international book fair. It was in Bucharest, in the main exhibition hall, next to the House of the Press. And there are all kinds of exhibitions. They were national stands. A lot of people, a lot of you know, yes, kind of promiscuous agglomeration. People were looking at products coming from all over the place. I was trying to go between the various fans of brochures and colored propaganda commercial materials, which, if they were offered free of charge, were a main attraction for everybody who was trying to fill up bags of plastic. Plastic bags, they were also very sought after at the time. I do not want to mention that the promotion by various companies for tools and machinery or automation systems was not really of interest to anybody. And since I was in my confusion moving from here to there, I never liked agglomerations. I reached a stand of which was Great Britain's, and I was my attention was attracted by a very elegantly dressed gentleman with a navy blue suit, and that was a very rare thing in that world. And I was still trying to approach him, and I read on the name badge that the name of the owner was Garabed Papazian, engineer. I'm flabbergasted. Here it is, an Armenian. I approach him and, smiling as friendly as possibly, I tell him in a shy voice the only possible question at that moment. Excuse me, sir, are you Armenian? Silence. The very well-clad gentleman, I was dressed very modestly with a shirt and really modest pants. He is looking down on me. He was also tall and handsome, and not just elegantly dressed. Bedros is my height, so not that. And he answers calmly with a vaguely, bored voice. After a meditation, I really don't know what he was thinking about. Like this, Ayo, yes, that this was not encouraging me to continue my possible dialogue. I, all smile, full of enthusiasm, I jump at him and say, I am Armenian too. Mr. Papazian, this is a current family name with Armenians, just as Khorasanjan is a rare one, pauses for a while and thinks what to say, probably. He's an engineer, just like myself, in fact. And then, after he finishes his cogitation, he says, and full of innuendos and understatements that are not followed by any words. Well, I am still trying to make to ask a few, 2 or 3 more innocent questions. I was not asking for anything anyway. I was not trying to get anything because I knew from my grandfather, who was from Agn, from Egine in today's Turkey, also called Bedros, who was telling me everything that is given for free is very expensive. And I remembered his advice. I never wanted to get anything for free. So then I said, well, I recovered immediately from my lyrical trance. I gave a few 4-letter words in Armenian and concisely. Otherwise, I also know more elaborate, more sophisticated Turkish 4-letter words, and I moved on. That is, I had no way to go, but I was moving around. And then in front of a pavilion, in front of which there was absolutely nobody, this was the Soviet Union pavilion, a well-clad man, not too tall, but sturdy, hairy, with a rather brutal look, passes by me hastily. And for a second, we looked at one another in the eyes. He took another 2 steps, came back, and with the voice of the general director of a Siberian combinat, steel combinat, almost shouts at me, Tunhayes. After the experience with Mr. Garabet Papazian, I said very shyly, Ayo, and that was all. My man, I don't remember his name, unfortunately, was from Tbilisi, and he jumps at me, embraces me warmly, and tells me, Akber Jan, dear brother, I will never forget. He then takes me with him, offers me a chair, goes after cartoon wall, and then comes up with a cognac bottle, of course Armenian cognac, to have a glass for our families. And then he is asking me, who is my mother, my father, if I had brothers, if I'm married, if I'm not, why will find a girl for you, if I have children, things of the sort. You don't have children, make as many as possible. And so this man had the answers to all the questions I was asking. And he was exactly at the opposite pole from Garabet, the British. I'm very sorry I don't remember his name, as I said. I could find an imaginary name for him, but this is where I want to get. That Armenians as they are not identical. They picked up something from the way of being of those with whom they have been in contact. With good things and bad things, we are as we are and not as we would like to be. This is pretty much the point with the identity of every ethnic group or individual. I'm telling you all this thinking of that Armenian from Tbilisi, but also of another one from Aleppo, Buenos Aires, and Venice. Somebody I never met, it was not meant to be, but who became my friend just by my reading his book and listening to one of his interviews. This is how it happens in this life. With some people, you can relate instantly, to others you don't, whether they are Armenian or not. This is how it is. So I'm very glad that Baron Abedis Hajian, the author of A Formidable Secret Nation, is in Bucharest again, and I can tell him my good things and all my good thoughts. Akber Jan, this is so. To close it, I just another story, which was in Berlin after 1989, of course. I had the fellowship at the Literarisches Kolloquium Berlin, and I was happy for the first time in my life to enjoy a house, things on the table, pocket money, without doing anything whatsoever. Writing something is really not a serious work. At the time, in the freshly reunited Germany, there was a story that was circulated. A German from East Berlin, an Aussie, meets a Bessie. And then the Aussie, more sentimental and so forth, jumps at the Bessie, embraces him warmly, and he says, we are one people, wir sind ein Volk. To which the guy from the Bessie, just like Garabet Papazian, the British, answered Riley, wir auch, so we are. This is pretty much like us Armenians. No matter what you say, we are of many kinds. This is not anthropology, it's a reality that frequently evades us. So I was just trying to ring up my friend Varujan Vosganian and tell him, look what crossed my head. Akber Jian, you are my brother. to which I would have received an energetic answer. Bedros, please, I'm very busy right now. I have a meeting at the union. We'll talk tomorrow. So this is something that is from Bedros. We wish him all the best, which is a kind of both way of having a kind of climactic moment in our meeting. Before, really, I forget, I want to mention that I was very happy to see that members of the Armenian community of Romania came here, including the Sergius Elian family, who came all over the place from Australia. Then Mrs. Madeleine Karakashian, who is a very, very, very important center figure of this Armenian Romanian community and its many ways its memory and its encyclopedia. And at some point there was Dumitru Avakian as well, who had to leave. He didn't feel very well. So I just wanted to mention that there were some, I don't mention the younger guys, starting with Sirun that you know. Yes, Sirun, you are among the younger guys. Yeah. So now, questions and comments to the papers that were given here, and were other questions and comments in the general discussion. First, Hago. Yeah.
Thanks a lot to both of you.
But please stand up and speak up.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for your fantastic presentations. I really enjoyed. I have two questions for both of you related to the Tosi. We mentioned the ambivalence as temporal layers, past, present, and future. And I wonder, is there any generational split when it comes to these temporal layers? Because I mean, the Syrian Armenians, I was not sure if you understand. So there's one generation you were focused on, younger people, compared to their parents, because I mean, when they came, they came with families, I guess, right? So that would be my first question. And the other one would be, could you also say a word about the integration strategies? And maybe a bit of homecoming. What are the conceptual properties of this? Because I guess I quite understood homeland concept, but what is homecoming? And Roswell, thanks a lot. I fully agree with your idea, and I think this reminded me of Hajj Kolonians. Another article which says if nations have nationalism, transnations like Armenia should have transnationalism in this case. And also your point that focusing on Armenia put unequal relationship towards diaspora, not secondary even, but hierarchization was changed, so they were not equal, diaspora was not equal to Armenia as an analytical entities. I wonder your concept about diaspora style nation building. What are the localities now? Because localities are changed since 2091. That's maybe engagement of political parties. And should it be based on a political new ideology or a cultural one? You know, what is the basis of this nation building?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for your questions, Hagop. So I'll try and address as many as I can. So this particular study looks at young people, and we've defined young quite broadly. So it's 20 to 39, broadly speaking. So some of them definitely have families and children. As I say, most of them were coming from 2011 onwards, but there are individuals, and I think I quoted from a few of them, who had come from the 90s. So there was this, like previous wave of Syrians and Lebanese and so on, much smaller in scale, who had settled in the 90s and maybe had maintained a kind of duality. So there are differentiations in that. So broadly speaking, the longer they've been there, of course, the more settled they are, and so on. But even amongst that group, there is a kind of reconsideration and a reflection based on what's happening in the 2020 war and so on. We haven't looked at children and so on. We did ask something about their children and schooling and stuff like that. Okay, so it's really interesting because obviously this is a very large wave of, 15,000 Armenian Syrians who have stayed according to, semi-official figures. And the UNHCR actually defines them as refugee-like, which is a specific category here. And when I interviewed the head of the UNHCR at the time, it was because of this kind of like acknowledgement that they're not refugees in the usual sense because they're co-ethnic Armenians, but also the UNHCR doesn't have the resources and the means to actually take care of them as refugees. Plus, a lot of them do not accept the label refugee. It's not something that, many people would be, happy having, particularly in this very complex situation where it's also a form of home and so on. So actually, Armenian civil society has been really active in helping with integration. Of course, there are state initiatives as well, and lots of initiatives that were done by the state to help them, to encourage them to come over, and that's in the wider paper. But civil society has been very active too. And here I'm thinking of particular organizations run by Syrians. So earlier waves of Syrians who came then set up organizations like Halep, for example, and others to help each other. So it's really quite an impressive infrastructure of refugees helping each other, if you like. And again, they may not accept that label, but essentially Syrians helping other Syrians and so on. There's also, very well-established organizations like Repat Armenia, which at the time when I went in 2016 was almost exclusively working with Syrians. So helping them, literally meeting them at the airport, helping them with finding housing, certainly helping them finding jobs and so on. Now that has been replaced really now with helping Armenians and others from Russia and from other post-Soviet countries. So the Syrians are far fewer, in terms of coming and so on at the moment. The homecoming label is interesting. You'll see it in obviously state narrative and so on. We had people who were sort of reflecting on that as a concept. I think people kind of feel they have to grapple with the notion of homecoming as diasporans, but it's not usually, their experience. It's not a coming home. There's a struggle and so on. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, the counterpoint here is, of course, the Jewish concept of Aliyah, yes, of the mystical duty to go back 2,000 years later in your zillionth diasporic experience. So your ancestors over 2,000 years have been absolutely everywhere. Nonetheless, there is this mystical concept of the absolute duty of going there, going back there. And then where this there is actually located, this is yet another problem. Whether or not this is really a truly ancestral Hebrew land, this is yet another disputed story by the very rabbis, by the way, because there is this original biblical story in which they are becoming Jews by just invading somebody else's territory and making it their own. So complexities about the homeland and diasporas abound everywhere. And in fact, this is a very interesting case now with Armenia proper, because you have, after several generations of multi-local diasporic experiences, you are trying to fantasize a homeland, but you are in the diaspora in your own homeland. And that's the superposition or this fusion of the motherland or the homeland and the diaspora and the experiences pertaining to them. That is, I guess, quite rhythmic. And then we'll take your question.
Could I just respond to that? Sorry, I want to, although return, of course, is a central concept in diaspora, Armenians have never had the equivalent of Zionism.
Yeah,
we've had Tebi Yergir as a slogan, but actually, in terms of people taking up the idea of returning, it's, very small numbers, which is why I think it is important to distinguish these group of people as refugees or displaced, or however they want to call themselves, rather than any idea of return, and really critique the notion of coming home or homecoming and so on, which is why also I brought up the notion of the step homeland.
Yes.
Razmik. Yeah, quickly to your first point, when the diaspora became sort of second class, there is a very clear Soviet Armenian policy, and you can trace this. You can trace this in the archives, because when they subbed the Spikayutyan Het Mishagutan Gabi Komite, the agency, in 1964, it had a very clear mandate to actually do this, to make Soviet Armenia as the homeland. Whereas HOK before that was established in the 20s didn't have this. So in the archives you see this, and I have some documents on that. And then you see it in the intellectual writings, in the writings of people, very, very popular writers like Silva Gabudikian and Gevorg Emin. Silva Gabudikian does go abroad and writes books about this. And there's a very clear things that homeland is here, Armenia. But what is also interesting is that this is picked up by diasporan intellectuals, the most known of which was Antoine Zarugian, who wrote the book Hin Yerazner Nor Jampaner, which the title in itself says what it is. And he completely internalizes and propagates this, that Armenia, the homeland, does not need the diaspora, we need the homeland. So we are doomed to disappear. Armenia is here to stay. So there is a very clear intellectual movement from the 1940s onwards. So we're not talking, we're talking about 80, 90 years. Well, not
and
quite.
This is driving the Nerkach, right?
And this is driving the Nerkach. It comes after the Nerkach. So it comes after the Nerkach. Sorry? They came to propagate this in the 1970s, 1960s. The Hunchaks before, but the Tashnaks only in the second half of the 1960s, and there are explanations as to why that was the case. Your other question, which is a very, very important question, where are going to be the next centers of diaspora nation building, diaspora identity building? It's difficult to say. But the trend shows that it's moving westwards. It's going to be most likely Los Angeles. It's going to be Montreal. It's going to remain Paris to some degree, given there is some intellectual movement. We're talking about intellectual centers. In Los Angeles, we're also talking about numbers. If I would look into a crystal ball, I would say that Los Angeles will develop its own very unique local Armenian identity with its own unique Creole language. Which will be Eastern, Western, Latin, Spanish, all mixed up together. So I think this is what the trend is showing. If there is no war in Lebanon, Lebanon could continue and start becoming more creative as opposed to very conservative, very Bahman Uragan. But there's a big if there is no war in Lebanon, So we don't know.
We take a last question from Levon Chukasian.
I want to say about paper of Razmik. I am very much impressed by the way that it was in a such a condensed way represented important events in political and cultural life of Armenians. But I have two questions. Don't you think that one of the goals of studying organization of repatriation of Armenians to Armenia from diaspora had the goal to weaken Armenian diaspora?
He mentioned that.
And I want to make a parallel with the perestroika, after perestroika, the provocation and initiation of war in Karabakh was also a continuation of this goal to weaken not only Armenia, but also the Armenian diaspora, which was always ready to help to Armenia. And this is first question. And the second question is, you wrote interesting data about the opinions of Armenian people concerning visionary leaders of Armenians. Maybe I missed it because I had the associations during your talk. Do you have such data concerning visionary leaders of present Armenia or during these 30 years?
Okay. I have not come across any evidence or interpretation to suggest that Stalin really cared one way or another about the Armenian diaspora. The main motive for me, as far as I know, for the repatriation was to strengthen Soviet Armenia, to repopulate and strengthen Soviet Armenia. And if that was at the expense of Armenians in the Middle East, he didn't care one way or another if the diaspora survived or not. He certainly cared that the Dashnaks did not survive. He wanted to destroy the Dashnaks. But again, for Stalin, that was small game. It was peanuts. He didn't really care about that. As to Nagorno-Karabakh, I think Nagorno-Karabakh was Soviets reacted to it. I think Moscow reacted. Gorbachev reacted to Nagorno-Karabakh. I don't think he started Nagorno-Karabakh. He had a situation. He had to deal with it. The second thing regarding the data, what I referred to is this massive Armenian diaspora public opinion survey, which is all the information is online. It's 14,000 interviewees, survey respondents. There is public opinion work done in Armenia. I know that, but it's not something that we have done, and I'm not knowledgeable of it. If others are knowledgeable, by all means, please mention. But I'm not knowledgeable of what kind of public opinion work is done in Armenia. I know it's done, but we haven't done it, and I don't have that data in front of me. This is all online. People could look this up online.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the time to say goodbye, to thank our audience, and then first of all to thank our participants of today and of yesterday, those who are with us, those who are not with us still. I think we have reached the goal of this conference, that is place Armenian identities in a transnational global focus. Think about the history of Armenia the way we think about the history of any other culture. That is, in many ways, disentangle the talk about Armenian identity from its, you see, emotional and understandably, tense original context in order to understand it better. So thank you very much for bearing with us, and then we'll see you again at another conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course, I thank the Union of Armenians of Romania.